My parents wanted my art studio for my sister's kids, but I was already leaving the country. That sentence sat at the top of my journal entry the morning it all began to unravel. I remember the light in the hallway, how it looked like old honey bleeding through the blinds. Landing softly on the hardwood, I had refinished myself. I had lived in this brownstone in Savannah for almost 6 years. My name is Mila. I'm 36, and I design spatial art installations for museums, community centers, and sometimes luxury galleries if the curators aren't too corporate. It's not the kind of work people understand right away, especially not my parents. My dad used to call it fancy clutter. My mom still thinks my degree from her ISD was a waste of time and tuition. But I stayed anyway, carved out a career slowly, mostly alone, until this spring, when the letters from Lisbon started coming in first with interest, then with an offer, a residency, 9 months, expenses paid, my own wing in a historical design center overlooking the river, and something clicked. Not in a dramatic movie moment way, quiet like a door unlatching at the back of my mind. I hadn't told anyone yet, not even Rachel, my mentor, who helped arrange the whole thing. I was still processing what it meant. I hadn't even decided if I deserved it. But then my younger sister Aubrey showed up, dragging 2 toddlers and a Louis Vuitton suitcase, trailing perfume and panic. Her husband Charles had left, not just the house, the state, the bank accounts too. One day he was golfing with his business partner. The next, his number was disconnected. My parents were devastated for her. Of course, not for me, not for what I'd lose, not for what they'd ask. That afternoon, Mom called while I was sketching lighting patterns for a sculpture proposal. Her voice had that sweet, firm tone she uses when she's already decided something. She didn't ask. She told me, "You know, Mila, your studio could be the perfect space for the children. All that light. And really, honey, it's time you think about what comes next. You're almost 40. How long are you going to keep playing with shadows?" I didn't answer right away. My pencil hovered in the air. That studio was the only place I ever fully exhaled. Every texture, every corner had my hands on it. From the old theater lights I rewired for my installation tests to the soft cedar cabinets I built to store raw materials. That space was never just a room. It was the only part of my life I hadn't compromised for anyone. I told her I needed time to think. She said Aubrey and the kids could be there by the weekend. They're your family. Sweetheart, you'll understand when you have your own. After we hung up, I sat alone in the middle of my studio, surrounded by boxes of cables, canvas swatches, and half-built miniature models. I stared at the paper in front of me, the lines blurred from where my hand had smudged them. I wasn't angry yet, not even shocked, just tired in a way I couldn't explain, because this wasn't new. This had always been the pattern. When Aubrey wrecked my car in college, I was the one who had to apologize for making her cry. When she tanked her first startup and begged me to co-sign her lease, I said no and got disinvited from Thanksgiving. Even Eli, my ex, who was once my best friend and first patron, walked away from us quietly after Aubrey told him I wasn't serious about our future. They never saw what I gave up to make space for her. And this time, they weren't asking. They were assuming. Later that night, I opened my inbox. The final paperwork from Lisbon was there, a gentle reminder from the coordinator. "We look forward to welcoming you. Please confirm your arrival date by Friday." I read it twice, then a third time, not blinking. And somewhere between line 3 and 4, a thought bloomed like ink in water. They think this space is theirs to take. But I've already begun packing my life into something bigger than this house. They just don't know it yet. 2 days later, they showed up unannounced. Aubrey rang the bell like it was her own front door, holding a baby on her hip and dragging a rolling suitcase behind her with her free hand. Mom followed right after. Balancing a tray of sandwiches like this was a casual family picnic, not a calculated invasion. I opened the door still wearing my paint-stained overalls, hands covered in charcoal from a scale sketch I'd been working on all morning. Mom barely noticed. She breezed past me, commenting on how dusty everything felt, then said I should consider more neutral colors if I wanted the space to feel welcoming. Aubrey walked straight into the studio without asking. Her daughter, barely 3, dropped a juice box on the floor next to one of my installations. I said nothing. I just watched the moment like a photograph I'd seen before. Blurry at the edges, but familiar in every way that mattered. While I made tea, they began measuring the walls, literally. Aubrey pulled out her phone and opened some interior design app. This corner would be perfect for the crib. She said to no one in particular, and I'm thinking of putting a book nook by the window. The lighting here is gorgeous. Mom agreed, adding that I could always paint in the garage if I really needed to, since you're more flexible than the kids. Mila. I stirred the tea slowly, letting the spoon hit the side of the cup a few more times than necessary, just to delay the moment of handing it over. My body felt still, but my mind had already started folding up the life I built in this space, not in fear, in quiet preparation. Dad called later that evening. He asked how the transition was going, like I was an intern, being reassigned to a less important department. I told him nothing had been decided. He said, "Your sister is going through a lot. It would mean the world to us if you could be mature about this." That word, mature, it's always the one they reach for when they want me to shrink and nod. I didn't argue. I just listened. He assumed silence meant agreement. They all did. That's how this family worked. The one who spoke less got the least, and for years, I had played that role perfectly. The next morning, Aubrey left a pile of folded toddler clothes on my studio bench. I moved them to the hallway, gently but deliberately. When she came back and saw them, she laughed like I was the difficult one. I figured I'd get a head start. Mom said we could start prepping the nursery this week. You don't mind? Right. Before I could answer, her son came running in with sticky fingers and grabbed one of my brushes from the supply rack. I asked him to stop, but Aubrey rolled her eyes and said, "He's just curious. Don't be so uptight. It's just art stuff." Just art stuff. That phrase lodged in my chest like a splinter. I thought of the commissions I'd completed that now lived in permanent exhibits. The museum in Denver that used my light sculpture to launch their new building. The gallery in Minneapolis that extended their exhibition because of the community response to my spatial piece on memory and grief. But to her, it was just stuff, temporary, replaceable, disposable. That night, I retrieved the Lisbon contract from my drawer and spread it out across the dining table. It was real. It had always been real. I had simply delayed believing in it. I reread every clause. I checked the visa steps. I emailed Rachel a quiet yes, with my departure date confirmed. Then I opened a second tab and emailed the Bloom Collective, the group of women artists I'd once mentored during a short residency last year. We had kept in touch. They had been looking for a permanent space. I told them the studio might be available soon, if they still needed it. They replied within 30 minutes. We'd be honored. Just say when. At midnight. I stood in the center of my studio, arms crossed over my chest, and looked around the room as if seeing it for the last time. The paint on the walls still smelled faintly of lavender oil from the last project. My grandmother's old drafting table stood against the far corner, worn but steady. I thought about what it would mean to let it all go, or rather, to leave it on my own terms. They wanted my silence. They wanted my space. They wanted me to nod and disappear so Aubrey could rebuild her life on top of mine. But I had other plans. They just hadn't read the fine print yet. 3 days into their so-called transition plan, I began noticing the small erasures. My sketchbooks were stacked neatly in a corner I hadn't touched. My tools were moved to the laundry closet, labeled with sticky notes that read things like maybe donate or storage. A framed photo of me and Eli, the last one we ever took, had been removed from the mantel. When I asked where it went, Mom waved a hand and said she thought it looked a little too somber for the children. I didn't push back. I simply picked it up from the box marked miscellaneous and placed it back on my desk without a word. They never noticed how often I chose silence instead of war. That was my first mistake. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a hammer. Aubrey was in the studio with Dad, hanging a set of pastel-colored nameplates for her kids. They hadn't even asked. I stood at the threshold, watching them joke about where to put a chalkboard wall. I asked if they were almost done. Dad looked at me and said, "Don't be difficult. Mila, it's just a few things. We can paint over it later." That line stuck with me, like my life was a phase they planned to whitewash as soon as I left the room. I stepped outside to breathe. The air was humid, thick with the scent of gardenias and wet concrete. My phone buzzed, a message from Rachel. Lisbon confirmed. Housing arranged. Can't wait to welcome you. Don't overthink this. I smiled at her timing. She always knew when I needed a reminder of who I was before I started bending. I looked up at my house, my studio, and realized how often I had made myself smaller to keep everyone else comfortable. This time, I wasn't shrinking. That afternoon, while Aubrey was out getting snacks for the kids, her iPad lit up on the kitchen counter. I didn't mean to look. It simply caught my eye. A new message from someone named Daphne, PR. The preview line read, "Have you considered framing the move-in as a story of sisterly sacrifice?" I froze. I opened the email. The full message detailed how Aubrey could pitch her story to a local parenting blog to gain sympathy and maybe land a small sponsorship or community grant. The angle of your sister offering her studio to support your children will resonate with moms. It positions you as resilient, your sister as nurturing, a perfect modern narrative. I put the iPad down like it was on fire. It wasn't just about taking space anymore. It was about rewriting the truth. They weren't just assuming my silence, they were turning it into a performance, monetizing it, rehearsing a version of reality where I was the supportive sibling and she was the struggling heroine. And none of it was true. Not the offer, not the generosity, not the decision. I hadn't agreed to anything, but it was already being packaged, already being sold. That night, Eli called. It had been over a year since we last spoke. His voice was steadier than I remembered, a little colder, maybe, but familiar. He said he'd been at an event and overheard someone mention Aubrey's name, something about a new blog and a branded motherhood story. He asked if I was involved. I said no, not by choice. He paused. Then, without being asked, he told me the thing I had always suspected but never confirmed. Years ago, when we were still together, Aubrey told him I was thinking of leaving the country with another artist. She showed him a fabricated message I'd supposedly written about being tired of him, about wanting more adventure and less stability. He believed her, and he let me go. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just let the information sit there in the room like a guest that wouldn't leave. Eli apologized. I said it didn't matter anymore, but it did. Not because I still wanted him, but because that was the moment I understood the pattern clearly. Aubrey had always written her own version of the truth, and I had always paid the cost. This time, she wasn't going to get the ending she expected. I walked back into the studio and stared at the walls she wanted to paint over. I imagined her blog post, the photos, the curated captions about grace under pressure and grateful children. I imagined sponsors lining up to support the poor, abandoned mother reclaiming her life in her sister's space. But I also imagined something else. A headline that read, "Visual artist donates studio to collective. Moves to Europe for career milestone." I imagined the collective thriving, creating, collaborating. I imagined not being here when the facade cracked. I sat at my drafting table and wrote a list, not of things to pack, but of things to let go, their opinions, their timelines, their version of me. Then I opened a new document titled Final Lease Agreement. The Bloom Collective would have my studio starting next month. I had Rachel review the contract that same evening. I signed it the next morning. By the end of that week, the house no longer felt like mine. My name was still on the deed. The furniture was still placed the way I liked it, and the scent of turpentine still lingered faintly in the hallway. But the energy had shifted. Aubrey had started referring to the studio as the playroom in casual conversation, slipping it into phrases like she was testing how it sounded aloud. Mom supported the rebranding without hesitation, calling it a seasonal shift in the house's purpose. I listened quietly, nodding when expected, while I worked on another kind of blueprint, one with no crayons and no bedtime rugs involved. The Bloom Collective sent over their updated proposal with signatures from all 5 members. Rachel, who had agreed to handle the transition in my absence, reviewed the legal structure. Everything was airtight. I also had the deed, scanned and ready. Should my parents decide to question who actually owned the house? They never asked. That's the part that still lingers. They assumed, with a kind of entitled confidence, that everything I had built was simply on loan until Aubrey needed it more. Meanwhile, I kept playing my part. I offered to pick up groceries. I feigned interest in nursery color swatches. I even gave Mom a list of local storage units she could use for my own art supplies. Of course, it was an act of precision, not deception. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was trying to buy time. Then came the first fracture. I returned from an errand to find a pile of my canvases by the back door, some already wrapped in plastic. Aubrey explained, too casually, that she was just helping me declutter and that she thought the hallway could make a perfect stroller zone. One of the wrapped frames had a note attached to it in her handwriting. Maybe Mila can donate this to one of her little galleries. I stared at the note for a long time. That particular piece had taken me 4 months. It was a memory wall, a tribute to my late mentor in Chicago, commissioned by a museum that ultimately never paid. It held grief and rage and resolve in its layers, things she'd never understand. I picked it up and moved it back to my studio. She didn't ask why. She never did. That evening, I called Eli. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I wanted to hear from someone who had once believed in me. Maybe I wanted to confirm that I wasn't imagining the erosion. He picked up on the first ring. We talked for 20 minutes. He never asked how I was. He just kept repeating how lucky Aubrey was to have me, how resilient I seemed. As if being stepped on gracefully was a virtue. I thanked him for the call and didn't correct him. I already knew he was past tense. By now, Dad had taken on the role of logistician. He was contacting painters, movers, even looking into gently used cribs online. One afternoon, I caught him pacing the studio while on the phone with someone from a local home renovation service, explaining dimensions and window orientations. I didn't interrupt. I took a photo silently and sent it to Rachel with a single line, "They think it's already theirs." I had 7 days left before departure. My flight was booked. The Bloom Collective had scheduled move-in the following Monday. Rachel would hand them the keys and oversee the transition. Everything was lining up. But on day 5, Aubrey tried to test something deeper. She asked if I could co-sign a new lease she was negotiating, just in case the kids need backup. She said Charles might contest custody and that having my name on paper would give her stability. I said I'd think about it. That night, she left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. I didn't mean to snoop, but the screen lit up when I passed by. It was a budgeting spreadsheet. One column said, "Monthly income projected from PR deals once studio secured." Next to it was a number that made my stomach tighten. There, in plain text. Was the plan flip the sympathy story into a personal brand? The studio wasn't a safe space for her kids. It was her next business model. That's when the last of my doubt dissolved. I wasn't being cautious anymore. I was preparing for departure. The life I had here was already folding in on itself, and I wasn't going to let it take me with it. My silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. And when I left, I wanted the exit to speak louder than all the years I'd been ignored. 2 days before my flight, Aubrey called a family meeting like she was the new head of household. She set it for Sunday afternoon, in the studio of all places, as if she were already its rightful owner. Mom baked lemon bars, Dad brought folding chairs, and I came downstairs in my usual cotton dress with my journal tucked under one arm. Aubrey had even set out hand-drawn sketches of what she called the new vision, a soft gray nursery palette with minimalist Scandinavian accents and quotes about motherhood framed above the changing table. I stared at the mock-up while she passed around color swatches, naming each shade with artificial warmth: cloud whisper, pebble song, fog embrace. I didn't say a word. I just took notes, not for the design, for the moment. Then she handed me a form, a pre-filled application for a short-term lease transfer addressed to a landlord who didn't exist. They still thought I rented the house, still hadn't bothered to ask how I bought it, still didn't know about the 3 years I'd spent rebuilding my credit, sacrificing commissions, turning down international contracts just to be able to afford this place. I looked up at her, then at Mom and Dad, who were nodding like everything made perfect sense. I asked, "And where do you think I'll go?" Aubrey smiled like it was already solved. "The guest room upstairs should be fine. We'll only need the studio and part of the hallway. You can still use the garage if you need a place to sketch." I didn't answer. I folded the form neatly and slid it into my journal. Then I stood up and asked if anyone wanted more tea. That's how quiet my boundary was. That's how calmly I ended the conversation. Later that night, when the house was asleep, I placed my packed suitcase by the door and sent Rachel a message. All green lights. Collective ready for Monday. Lease signed. Studio prepped. She responded instantly. "We'll be there at 9 a.m. sharp. Proud of you." I turned off the phone and sat on the floor of my studio for the last time as its invisible owner. not sad, not afraid, just ready. The next morning, Aubrey stormed into the kitchen holding my journal. She had gone through my things. She had read every detail, the departure date, the legal lease, the confirmation email from Rachel, even the section where I described the exact ways I'd been erased without confrontation for over a decade. Her face was flushed with disbelief. "You're abandoning us," she hissed. "You're doing this behind our backs." I poured my coffee, calm as ever, and replied, "No, I'm doing this in plain sight. You just never bothered to look." Mom entered next, holding the lease Rachel had printed and mailed. Dad followed close behind, already pulling up contacts on his phone, calling lawyers, trying to find someone who could stop what he didn't understand. They demanded to know how I had bought the house, why I kept it a secret, what my plan was. I said nothing. I just opened the drawer of the studio desk and handed them the property deed with my name printed clearly across the top. For the first time, the room went silent. I stood in that silence with a steadiness they hadn't seen before. I told them the Bloom Collective would be arriving Monday morning, that I'd be in Lisbon by then, and that I would not be leaving any keys behind. I told them I had documented every conversation, every suggestion, every move they had made in this house without my consent. Aubrey cried. Mom begged. Dad got angry. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I just said, "You were so busy deciding how to use my space. You forgot to ask if I was still living here." Then I left the room and sat by the window as the sun stretched across the studio walls. It caught the edge of a broken frame I hadn't fixed yet, casting a shadow shaped like a door slightly ajar. I watched it for a long time, realizing that what I was about to do wasn't revenge, it wasn't punishment, it was preservation of peace, of autonomy, of everything they never noticed I was building while they were busy rewriting me. On Monday morning, the Bloom Collective arrived right on time, a quiet wave of calm energy and focused movement. Rachel led them in while I stood outside with my luggage already packed in the back of a rideshare car waiting at the curb. The women carried easels, sealed crates of materials, and carefully labeled boxes marked with things like projection tech and archival paper stock. Their presence was not loud, but it was unmistakable, the kind of quiet that doesn't apologize, the kind that fills a room by simply belonging there. Through the window, I watched Aubrey standing frozen in the center of the studio, one hand on her hip, the other clutching her phone like it might reverse time if she pressed hard enough. Mom was pacing near the kitchen, still in her nightgown, visibly shaken. Dad was on the phone again, likely trying to reach a lawyer who could explain to him that ownership cannot be undone with frustration. I didn't step inside. Rachel handled everything. She always did. With efficiency and grace. She smiled at Aubrey, extended the lease packet again, and gently reminded her that this had been planned for months and that nothing was up for discussion. I didn't need to hear their words. I'd already heard them in different forms for years. The disbelief, the anger, the spin, but this time, there was no space left to twist the narrative. Every signature was on paper, every boundary backed by law. I climbed into the car, waved once to Rachel, and left without looking back. Let them sit in the quiet I'd occupied for so long. Let them finally feel what it's like when someone stops absorbing the blame and simply walks away. The flight to Lisbon was uneventful. I didn't drink the champagne the attendant offered until we were in the air, gliding just above the cloud line, as the sun painted the Atlantic in sheets of soft orange and blue. I pulled out my sketchbook and drew the outline of a house from memory, not with precision, but with feeling. The windows slightly off, the corners uneven, the studio replaced with an open void. I called it erasure. It wasn't bitter. It was honest. When I landed, Rachel had already sent an update. They're furious. Her message read, "Aubrey tried to block the movers." Mom cried. Dad called me a fraud. The collective remained unfazed. Your name's on the lease, the deed, the foundation grants. Everything's handled. Go live your life. I didn't reply. I simply stood at the edge of my new studio, this time in Lisbon, where tall ceilings and sunlit floors framed a different kind of quiet, not the silence of compliance, but the stillness of clarity. I unpacked one box, just one. Inside it were the brushes Aubrey told me to throw out, the sketchbook she once called too abstract, and a ceramic mug with a chip at the handle, the one Eli gave me before things got complicated. I set it down beside the window and let the moment settle. Back in Savannah, the fallout had begun. Local blogs started asking questions when the Bloom Collective posted their arrival photo. A caption under it read, "Thank you, Mila, for choosing creation over chaos." The comments came quickly. People were curious. Some remembered my installations. Others wanted to know the story. Aubrey tried to get ahead of it, posting a staged photo of her kids in an empty corner of her new rental with the caption, "Starting over, when your own family leaves you." But the truth had already taken root. An anonymous comment surfaced under her post. "Didn't you try to kick your sister out of her own studio?" Then another, "Wasn't that house hers? Didn't she fund your rent last year?" The narrative slipped, and with it, her grip. Eli, of all people, sent me a screenshot. "Thought you'd want to see this. Looks like people are waking up." I didn't gloat. I didn't forward the message to anyone. I didn't even respond. I just opened my journal and wrote one line beneath that old phrase. My parents wanted my art studio for my sister's kids, but I was already leaving the country. Then underneath, in smaller print, I added, they assumed I'd vanish quietly. Instead, I made space for something real. 3 weeks after I arrived in Lisbon, a journalist reached out through Rachel's gallery. She said she had been following the Bloom Collective's work and had come across my name in connection to the story that was starting to circulate online. She asked if I wanted to comment. I declined the interview, but agreed to let Rachel release a short statement confirming the facts. Yes, I owned the studio. Yes, I had signed it over legally to a collective of artists. No, I had not abandoned anyone. I had simply chosen to leave when it became clear my presence was no longer seen as valid. The statement went live quietly, without dramatics, but the response wasn't quiet at all. Within 48 hours, multiple posts surfaced from people who had crossed paths with Aubrey in various business ventures, moms from her networking groups, even a former assistant from one of her failed lifestyle projects. They shared stories of manipulation, exaggerated hardship narratives, and how she always managed to be the center of sympathy while others did the work behind the scenes. One of them included screenshots of texts where Aubrey referred to my art as backup income and bragged that I'd never say no to the kids. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. The pieces were falling together on their own. Back home, my parents remained silent publicly, but I knew from Caitlin, the lawyer Rachel helped me connect with, that they were scrambling behind closed doors. Dad had tried to contest the legality of the lease, but his name wasn't on any paperwork. Mom had reached out to the country club, asking them to issue a clarification after one of the members brought up the situation in a private gathering. The club refused. Word was spreading, and not in the way they had hoped. The narrative had shifted. I wasn't the selfish daughter anymore. I was the woman who left with dignity, after years of being erased politely. Then the letter arrived, a handwritten note from Mom, scanned and sent by email, since they no longer had my physical address. It started with what looked like an apology, but quickly turned into guilt. She asked if I understood what I had done to the family's image, how much stress Aubrey had endured, and whether I could consider at least making a public statement to help smooth things over. I read the letter twice, once as a daughter and once as a woman who had spent years being cast as disposable, both times. I decided not to reply. That same week, the Lisbon Gallery confirmed my first solo show in Europe. They titled it Negative Space, a collection of installations built from voids, shadows, and traces of things removed. It felt right. The centerpiece was a suspended room made entirely of thread, each strand representing a conversation that had gone unheard. Visitors would step inside and feel the tension without being able to see its source. I didn't explain it. I let them stand quietly in the middle and draw their own meaning. Some came out in tears. Others walked out slowly, like they had touched something they couldn't describe. That was enough. Eli messaged again. He had been quiet since forwarding the original blog post that spiraled everything. This time, he said he had talked to Charles, Aubrey's ex, apparently. Charles had known about the lease situation long before it went public. Aubrey had told him it was a temporary arrangement and that I would get over it eventually. She'd even shown him mock-ups of her planned rebranding campaign. Using the studio as a backdrop for sponsored content, Charles hadn't said anything because, in his words, I figured you'd cave, like always. I thanked Eli for the honesty, but I didn't respond further. That part of my life was no longer mine to repair. Later that night, I walked to the river and sat on the stone steps beneath the old bridge, sketchbook in hand. I didn't draw anything. I just stared at the water, thinking about how far I'd come without anyone noticing until I was gone. They had written me into a role for years, supportive, quiet, available. But the moment I stopped playing it, their story fell apart, not because I made noise, but because I removed myself from the stage and let the spotlight turn on them. A month after the exhibition opened, I received a message from a curator in Paris requesting to include 2 of my installations in their fall program. They had seen photos of the Lisbon show online and were particularly drawn to a piece I called Inheritance, a room framed by shadows cast from nothing, no furniture, no voiceover, just presence and absence, alternating like breath. I said yes without hesitation. That same afternoon, Rachel walked into the studio with a bottle of wine and a printout from a regional news site back in Georgia. The headline read, Family Fallout Sparks Online Backlash for Influencer Sister. It wasn't a hit piece. It was simply factual, a recount of what had happened. It included a copy of the deed, interview snippets from the Bloom Collective, and quotes from art critics framing the entire situation as a case study in quiet boundaries and creative agency. The comments were brutal, not because people were angry for me, but because they saw themselves in it. Dozens of women describing how they'd been written out of their own stories, minimized for the sake of a sibling's mess or a parent's narrative. Some even admitted they hadn't known they were allowed to leave, let alone thrive. That struck me more than anything, not the chaos I'd left behind, but the clarity that arrived when someone else gave it language. Back in Savannah, Aubrey was silent online, her Instagram account, once filled with curated photos of matching outfits and pastel-colored breakfasts, had been set to private. But people were still talking. An anonymous account posted a series of voice recordings Aubrey mocking my art, laughing about how she convinced our parents that I'd be fine with anything, even sleeping in the garage. The audio spread quickly. Eli sent it to me with no caption. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to explain. Dad resigned from the board of a local foundation he once chaired, after donors began questioning whether he'd help facilitate the takeover of my studio through coercion. Mom stopped attending her monthly book club. Word was she couldn't handle the glances, the unspoken judgment, the fact that their private family choreography had become public. But even then, they didn't reach out with apology. They reached out with requests. Rachel forwarded a message from my mother asking if I'd consider clarifying the sequence of events to protect Aubrey's reputation. She said it wasn't too late to make it look like a misunderstanding. I read that line twice, then deleted the message without answering. It hadn't been a misunderstanding, it had been a pattern. The Bloom Collective was thriving. Photos of their new works flooded social media, with captions thanking me for creating space, for believing in what women could build when no one was watching. They offered to name one of the new exhibits after me. I said no, not because I wasn't grateful, but because the work stood on its own. My name didn't need to be attached to be present. Sometimes giving room is the most permanent thing you can leave behind. One night, I stood at the edge of the terrace at the residency house and looked out over the Tagus River. The lights from the city glittered on the surface like scattered gold leaf. In that moment, I wasn't angry or vindicated. I was simply still. And for the first time in years, I wasn't measuring the cost of every choice against someone else's comfort. I thought about the little girl I used to be, sitting in the corner of family dinners, listening to adults talk over her head, learning how to disappear politely. She would have been proud of this silence, not the one used to endure, the one that follows a decision no one else thought you'd make. Then came the email. A well-known gallery director in New York had read the coverage and was interested in developing a show around the theme of reclaiming space. They were offering a full commission and travel coverage, plus publication in an international art journal. I forwarded it to Rachel with 2 words, "Let's go." She replied immediately with flight options and one line that made me pause. They finally see what you never needed to prove. The New York show opened in early autumn, framed by gold leaf columns and stark white walls. My installation, titled Absence Negotiated, was positioned in the center of the main room. It featured suspended panels of clear acrylic etched with words people had tried to use to define me: supportive, manageable, selfish, dependable. Each panel was spaced just far enough apart to let viewers walk between them, brushing past the labels, seeing their own reflections ghosted over mine as guests filtered in. I stood at the back of the gallery in quiet observation. I didn't introduce myself. I didn't need to. The work was already doing what years of explanation never could. Across the room, I saw Eli again for the first time since Lisbon. He wore a dark suit, hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the installation like he was reading a version of history he hadn't realized he'd lived through. When he approached, he didn't say hello immediately. He just looked at me for a long time before finally asking, "Do you feel lighter now?" I answered without thinking, "Not lighter, just clearer." He nodded and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a newspaper clipping. My father had formally stepped down from the board of his company. The article cited internal investigations, conflict of interest, and questionable financial support given to a family member without proper documentation. I didn't ask who leaked it. I didn't have to. The same day, Rachel forwarded a press inquiry from a national publication requesting an interview about the Bloom Collective's origin story. The writer had uncovered documents showing how Aubrey attempted to register the studio as a nonprofit under her own name just weeks before the collective moved in. The request asked if I'd like to go on record. I declined. Again, the truth was already louder than anything I could say. Letting people discover it themselves was more powerful than defending myself ever had been. That evening, I received one more message, this time from Mom. It was brief. We didn't see you. I think we never wanted to. Your father won't admit it, but he knows. Aubrey's kids miss you. Aubrey's falling apart. She won't say it, but she's scared. I don't expect you to respond. Just wanted you to know that we read the lease. We saw the work. We understand now that it wasn't just a room you were protecting. It was yourself. I didn't reply. I didn't even feel anger, just a quiet, tired recognition, the kind of knowing that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be complete. I walked outside, past the line of guests still waiting to enter the gallery, and turned down a quiet street toward the river. The city felt still in that moment, like it was holding its breath between seasons. I thought about Aubrey and her curated worlds, how many layers she had built on top of other people's effort, how easily they crumbled once the foundation was taken away. I didn't hate her. I just couldn't hold her anymore. Not in my home, not in my life, not even in my memory without rewriting the terms. Back in Lisbon, the Bloom Collective had just launched a community program for young women from underrepresented backgrounds, teaching installation art and creative entrepreneurship. They sent me photos of the studio I once called mine, now alive with movement, laughter, light, and art in every corner. The mural I'd left unfinished on the back wall had been completed by a 19-year-old who'd never picked up a paintbrush before joining the program. She titled it, Room Kept for Me. I looked at the image for a long time, then sent a single response. Tell her she didn't just finish it, she claimed it. That night, I opened my journal and turned back to the first page where the words still sat. My parents wanted my art studio for my sister's kids, but I was already leaving the country. I added a final line beneath it, not as a punchline or a moral, just a quiet truth that had taken me years to earn. I didn't leave to punish anyone. I left because I was finally ready to be seen by the only person who ever needed to understand me, myself. 6 months after the gallery show, I returned to Lisbon for a short residency extension. The invitation had come unexpectedly, attached to a message from the director that simply read, "The room still remembers you." I didn't hesitate. I packed lightly this time. No brushes, no frames, no blueprints for installations, just a small notebook, a pair of worn gloves, and the chipped ceramic mug Eli once gave me, now carrying nothing but quiet meaning. The city felt warmer, not in weather but in welcome. Familiar buildings greeted me like old friends. The river moved slower, and my breath fell into rhythm without effort. It didn't feel like running anymore. It felt. One afternoon, I passed by the studio where the Bloom Collective still worked. They had added a new section to the entrance, a community wall where artists could leave notes, sketches, or reflections. One particular tile caught my eye. It read, "This space taught me how to take up room without apology. No signature, no timestamp, just truth." I didn't write anything in return. I simply touched the corner of the tile gently and walked away. Some things don't need repetition to stay alive. Some things. Once clay, On my final evening, I sat on the rooftop with Rachel. We watched the sun lower itself over the skyline in slow motion, letting its light fill every crack in the terracotta tiles. She asked if I ever heard from them again, my parents. Aubrey, anyone. I told her the truth. There had been one final message from Dad, just a few lines, without punctuation. We lost everything. Not sure what to do anymore. Your mother is not speaking to anyone. Aubrey has left the city. We don't know where she is. I hadn't replied. Not out of anger, just peace. I had nothing more to offer their chaos. I had all read. A month later, the art journal I had contributed to published an essay I wrote under a pseudonym. The title was Reclaiming the Room They Painted Over. In it, I never named anyone. I never pointed fingers. I simply described the process of choosing yourself after being edited out of your own life. I wrote about space, how it can heal when honored, how it can suffocate when misused. I wrote about inheritance, not in wealth, but in wounds. And I wrote about absence, how leaving doesn't always mean breaking. Sometimes it means building something elsewhere. The response surprised me. Readers wrote letters, not emails, real ones, folded pages filled with stories of silent sacrifice, of giving up dreams for family roles, of finally walking away when no one believed they would. Some said my words gave them language for something they thought was only happening to them. Others said nothing at all, just included photos of empty rooms with notes like, I didn't fill it, I left it, and that was enough. I kept everyone. Months passed. Opportunities came and went. New shows, new cities, new beginnings that didn't need me to over-explain my past. But every now and then, in quiet corners of airports or cafes, I'd meet someone who had read the piece, someone who recognized that particular kind of stillness. They'd smile gently, sometimes with a knowing look, and we'd nod in mutual recognition. That was the only closure I ever needed. People often say revenge is the best closure. I disagree. Revenge depends on being seen by those who once dismissed you. But real peace, the kind that doesn't tremble in the dark, comes when you no longer require their recognition. It comes when your own reflection finally looks back without apology. That, for me, was the ending I never thought I'd earn. So if you're sitting in a borrowed room right now, afraid to speak, afraid to move, afraid they'll call you selfish if you leave, remember this. You don't have to win the argument. You don't have to convince anyone. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is quietly collect your things. Close the door they never thought you'd walk through, and leave it swinging open behind you, because there is a difference between being selfless and being erased. And once you see it, you don't go back. What would happen if you finally stopped asking for space and started taking it?